Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to the State of Economy podcast with the Business Line. I'm your host, Venkatesha Babu, a deputy editor with the newspaper. Today, we have a very interesting guest, Siddharth Sid Pai, as he is known. He is a technology consultant who has personally led over $20 billion in complex, first-of-a-kind outsourcing transactions. I have known Sid for at least 2 decades. He has been a pioneer in the IT outsourcing industry, as well as seen the evolution of the sector. He now advises boards, CEOs, and investors. He also runs a venture fund, prolific writer. Sid, thank you for taking the time. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Venkatesha. It's absolutely an honor to be here. I have a lot of respect for the publication, as you well know, and as of course you, having worked with you for, as you said, almost 2 decades now. I'm very, very honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
So without much ado, last 20 odd years, the IT services industry has been one of the biggest generators of white collar jobs in India specifically. Globally, the kind of changes which have happened have been phenomenal. You have had a ringside view, first as a participant, now as an advisor, advising several of these parties involved in this kind of deals and transactions. There have been 3 inflection points over the last couple of decades. One was in the immediate aftermath of the 2000 dot-com burst,
Yes.
then the 2008 economic crisis, and of course, the most recent one was what happened with regard to COVID.
Yes.
How do you see the evolution going forward? What are the kind of changes which have taken place, Sid? And if you could weigh in with your thoughts on this.
Definitely. Yeah. So it's a lot of ground to cover, Venkatesha. So I'll try and specifically talk about the industry, but I'll hone in on those 3 inflection points that you talked about and give some anecdotes as well with respect to, as an observer, both inside and now outside the industry, how it felt to me at that point in time and what actually happened. So let's go back, I guess, in time a little bit, because it sort of helps to understand the continuum of time and where we are. So history actually sort of gives a great perspective for why we are where we are today. So let's go back, I guess, to the late 90s. At the time, I was a senior executive with IBM, had responsibility first in the US and then later in Europe for the telecommunications sector, consulting and services, and IT services, that is. And as a result, had quite a large number of people, at least for those days, and a large P&L that I was managing. And this was during the Y2K timeframe. And working at IBM at that point, obviously, since IBM had themselves written most of the code which was not Y2K compliant, the expectation was that IBM would fix what they had not done correctly in the first place. But in IBM, we never really built a very large Y2K team. It was a small team because the expectation from a visioning standpoint that we had as executives was that this was a small problem which had a finite time. In other words, as of 1st of January 2000, the problem would cease to exist because everything would have been fixed and the opportunity in trying to fix what needed to be fixed would be done. So IBM took a very interesting decision. They took a decision to only have a small number of people focused on the Y2K opportunity. I think at the same time, there were certain Indian majors who took a decision, some of them who agreed with IBM and took the decision like IBM. Some of them are not around today, like Patni, for instance, which at the time was larger than Infosys, which is larger than Wipro, larger than many other firms. It was actually one of the largest firms. But they too, like IBM, felt that this was a short-term issue. It had a horizon, it would end. And so therefore, it did not make sense to build up, a large bench to support Y2K. So, Y2K happened. And actually, the work didn't fall off immediately. Something different happened. What happened was that the dot-com madness, which had overtaken a lot of what was being done at that point in time, suddenly that bubble was burst for a variety of reasons, not dissimilar to some of what we are seeing today. But nonetheless, when it burst at that point, and a lot of the engineers who had come on board, whether from Infosys or TCS or Wipro, some of the larger names that you hear today, were going back to India at that point. I remember derisive comments that we were making, and to be honest, I was also part of them, where we said they were all going B2B, which is back to Bangalore. That was the view. But what people didn't realize was that by then so much of fiber had been laid undersea and had not yet been lit, that the amount of capacity from a telecommunications perspective was so large because of the dot-com boom, that now you didn't really have to take the worker to the work in America or the UK. The work could be sent to the worker sitting in Bangalore, in India, which really was the reason for the boom in IT outsourcing services in the early 2000s, culminating actually to a point where they started to win some of the really large deals and be accepted as being equals of the IBMs and the Accentures. And in fact, I did one of those watershed deals. It was a deal in 2005 with for ABN AMRO Bank. And the two main players who won most of that business were Infosys and TCS. I negotiated that deal on behalf of ABN AMRO. And that was actually the deal with which Indian IT majors for the first time had won a mega deal and had broken onto the world stage. And then after that, it was a set of several victories after that in the next 2 or 3 years that followed.
If I may come in, Sid, it's so interesting that you mentioned that while a few players saw Y2K as a limited opportunity, several others saw this as a foot in the door through which they could leverage relationships built, which actually helped them post the dot-com burst, and which, as you rightly pointed out, culminated in this mega deal in 2005. And even earlier, even for IBM in India, for instance, when they had the Airtel deal, which was worth more than $1 billion in the domestic market. Who would have thought that an Indian company would be able to provide $1 billion kind of a deal? And that only showed the kind of potential the industry and the sector had.
Yes, absolutely right. But there's a subcontext also to that, Venkatesha. And the subcontext is that the ones who did really well among the Indian players were the ones who took the risk on the bet with Y2K, right? And staffed up to the point where they had enough people who were ready to accept all this outsourcing work as the squeeze in the US forced the local companies to look for lower costs, which they could get here back in India. So basically, the narrative is that the companies like the Covansys or Patnis who did not ramp up, they're not around today. They got swallowed up, and they got they like TCS and Infosys and Wipro, simply because they took the risk of building up their bench, became much larger than companies like Covansys or Patni. And fortune favors the brave, as they say, right? And that was the main reason for their stupendous growth after that, was because they actually took that risk.
But the immediate gloom and doom which followed the global financial crisis in 2008, I remember a lot of people saying that it was again, the end of the story as far as the IT services industry and the outsourcing bit was concerned. And Indian IT actually sailed out pretty well, even in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I think the one advantage that Indian IT will have, and this actually touches on something slightly different, that is also, we all know but don't realize how important it is the demographic advantage that we have in India. Our population is very young. So as a result, what happens is that the number of employable people entering into the marketplace every year is extraordinarily high. So even if there is a situation where there is difficulty for the Indian IT majors in the short term, this steady availability of lower priced talent, the freshers as we call them, is a steady large pool coming in. So what happens is that they are able to continuously reinvent themselves, and through attrition, which happens for a variety of reasons, as well as tightly managing what their overall costs look like, they have been able to bring in youngsters to take the place of the mid-level people who start to cost them too much. So that was a classic case of pyramid rationalization happening in 2008. There was a little bit of a bump, but they picked up soon after that, after about a couple of quarters of a bump. I'm looking at some numbers here, which I have from a variety of different analysts that cover the sector. If you go back to 2007, there's a small blip right around the end of 2007, early 2008, where there was a small fall, specifically looking at Infosys and Accenture, which are two numbers I've got over here. They had about 3 percentage point dip at that point in what their quarter-on-quarter growth was. And the other ones which did not have a dip moderated significantly. So they went from having 10% growth to 4% growth in the years before that to suddenly having only 1% or this negative 3% that I was talking about. So that was quite a reduction during that 2008 GFC, as you pointed out. But despite that reduction, they could regroup. And by the time business started coming back to them in the latter half of 2008, and actually more toward the latter half of 2009, they were ready to pick up that slack, and their growth rates went back to the high single digit, low double digit type of growth rates per quarter that we had long associated with the industry.
Even in the most recent instance of the COVID shutdowns, which affected everybody across the world, initially there was a huge degree of apprehension on how these firms, which had built massive infrastructure under a single roof, where they would bus literally thousands of people to come in and work under a single roof, how they would fare in such a situation. But they came out with flying colors. Touch a little bit on that too.
Sure. I mean, there too, it was but there is a slight difference which I will touch on in a little while. But again, let me just give you some numbers which will help. If you look at the March 20 quarter, again, the quarter-on-quarter growth, this is when it really exploded on the scene. If you remember, that is when we had our first lockdowns and so forth. It was in 2020. And so the most of the hit actually that happened during that March end quarter, and then the succeeding June quarter. And I'm reading these numbers out with I'm only talking about Indian majors here. I won't name them, but I will tell you what the numbers are for both March and June. Minus 2% growth, minus 4.8% growth. These are some really large players. That is 5% shrinkage, actually, if you think about it. Some of them minus 2.3, minus 0.7, minus 1.8. In one case, there was a minus 4.3 and a minus 8.2. So in those two quarters, they saw a significant drop because of the fear and this, and the world basically seizing up and going into a mode where nothing was happening except keeping the lights on where they could, right? And I think for those 3 to 6 months, there was a significant amount of slowdown globally. But interestingly, what happened was that there was a second revelation that just like, you could send work to Bangalore, you could send work to people's homes in Bangalore or in Bhilai or anywhere else they chose to be, because the telecom infrastructure within our own country has now, come to a point where we can have fairly reliable connections, such as the one we have on this call. And so therefore, the ability to send work to employees' homes came in, and that kicked in a big way. And once again, we saw Indian IT majors really grow after that little bit of degrowth or reduction in size, as they call it, in early 20.
Sid, one of the reasons why I wanted you to dwell a little bit on these three incidents in the last couple of decades was to bring you to the current situation of the industry. Couple of industry leaders, even external analysts, say that unlike, say, the dot-com as well as the macro financial crisis which the world faced in 2008, which were more largely structural and sectoral in a sense, whereas COVID was more of a black swan event. There is a fundamental shift now happening because of generative AI and the kind of capabilities it brings. Do you see this as a kind of a inflection point where the industry again needs to drastically reinvent? Do you see slowdown? All of us have seen the kind of growth which has been witnessed over the last couple of quarters. There has been a considerable slowdown, both in terms of the business as well as in terms of the people being employed in the sector. So how do you see the challenges which the sector faces now?
Sure. So Venkatesh, there are actually two questions there. And there are two things that are going on parallelly. So we can speak about both. So first, let me touch on generative AI because you spoke about that. For a long time, this has been a sector, that is computer programming, has been like a snake that's eating its own tail. It's getting easier and easier to do. There are open source libraries that are available on the net. I can go and pick up pieces of code which will execute certain level of functionality without my having to go and rewrite it all over again. There are several that are out there. Microsoft bought some, others have bought some. They've been having these GitHub, for instance. These are all areas where one, as a programmer, can go and start composing code as opposed to having to write code. So you cut and paste basically from various parts of various libraries that are available out there, and then you compose and put together something which finally executes the business functionality that you're looking for. This is a factor that's been going on for a while. Parallel to this, there has been automation happening of certain types of roles within the computer programming and the infrastructure management industry. So if you look at infrastructure management, firms like HCL grew significantly on the back of outsourcing of infrastructure management. But that was suddenly taken away by the large cloud companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Google, because where is the need to manage the infrastructure if it no longer belongs to you and you're renting it? You're renting it from an Amazon will take care of it. So there's no need for you to go as a Bell South or as a US West or as a British Telecom or whatever and own your machines anymore. They will be owned by Amazon. So that's
so infrastructure as a service, when it became mainstream, obviously this part of the business for the likes of HCL disappeared.
Yes, it disappeared. But you see, this is something that's been going on for a while. And this business of composing code, this has been also going on for a while. And so when we look at generative AI, it's just another sort of addition to this long list of automation of various types of computer coding, as well as various types of computer maintenance. Generative AI can write code much quicker than having to go to several different libraries. That's true. So therefore, as a result, will there be some pressure on IT majors, whether they're Indian or otherwise? Yes, there will be, because generative AI will be able to develop at least 60-70% of the code that's required without you having to have somebody compose it for you. Then the last 30-40% can be composed by a computer programmer or a set of programmers, which means that your need for people is less as a result. So therefore, it's safe to say that there will be a short-term reduction in what is being done by the IT majors. But as in the past, what I truly feel is that they will find other areas which are adjacent, which still require the large numbers of people that we have that are still available to us at low cost, which is the second vector that I wanted to talk about. During the COVID boom, a lot of our Indian IT majors were very short-sighted. They poached each other's staff at, 200% of their existing salary, that kind of stuff, which is not sustainable. You cannot pay somebody who was making, let us just take an example, somebody who was making 5 lakhs yesterday, you suddenly, if you're paying them 10 lakhs today for doing exactly the same work, that's not a sustainable increase that you can have. And as a result, what's happened to most of these IT majors is that their margins have dropped, their employee costs have gone up significantly, and the performance that one was expecting out of them has also slowed down quite tremendously, because there is an overall slowdown globally now post-COVID. And so therefore, I think what they've done is they've shot themselves in the foot slightly by having overpaid for the middle level resource. Now, the good news is, because of the availability of all the youngsters who are still coming in, and by the way, we talked about knowing each other for 20 years, the basic salary for somebody with a bachelor's degree in engineering entering into one of these companies has stayed more or less the same for the last 20 years. So let me be specific. It was just under, in about 2002 or 2003, the average of what they were being paid was just around 3 lakhs of rupees, or slightly less. Today, 20 years later, it is still a similar sum. It is only 3 lakh 50. So, all they will do is they will bring in a lot more youngsters, and they will take out all these people whom they paid 200%, 250% to. They will just let them attrit out. And the problem is they have not timed it correctly. If this slowdown had come, a little bit more gradually, or better yet, if they had not gone out and spent the money that they did in the greed to make short-term return, they would not have such a large problem on their hands right now. Right now, they have to attrit a large number of staff. It's very difficult for them to go out and talk about layoffs and things like that, because the first one to talk about layoffs will cause a domino effect. And then the amount of confidence that one has in this industry will go down. But we're beginning to see it. I mean, recently, for instance, Wipro, it's been, the New Indian Express reported that Wipro has gone back and reduced the salaries that it is willing to provide to freshers. They had originally made them offers at 6.5 lakhs. Now they've said, listen, the same job is available, but it's only available at 3.5 lakhs per annum. They're not the only ones. There are other companies who are also doing so. So,
if I read what you're saying, Sid, correctly, one, you are saying that there is significant more pain left, which
yes,
needs to be undergone before this goes into the self-corrective loop, which it has done in the past.
correct.
Second, you are saying that generative AI is just another add-on. It is not like people will find innovative ways of utilizing the cheap talent available to do more things.
Yes.
You are saying that it's not as if that permanently that the industry is looking at a downward growth trend. Is my reading correct from what you're stating?
Yeah, your reading is right. That summary is an excellent summary. There is some more pain, and is largely self-inflicted. It's largely, it's like a hangover. If I don't drink alcohol, but I'm told that if you drink too much alcohol, if you wake up the next morning, you have bad headache and you have bad, you don't have the ability to deal with the day, which I think is where most of these IT majors are today. So the hangover pain will last for some more time, is my assessment. After which, generative AI, while it will have an effect, will not. It will not be such a large effect as we are worrying that it will be. It will reduce the amount of programming that one is doing, but the types of programming that people are expected to do will change, which is fine. And I think we should welcome generative AI, at least with respect to what it can do for specific tasks like chatbots, or for some of the creative work, helping us with some of the creative work. For instance, writing, or even writing articles, or even writing code, it's always better to start with an outline. And generative AI can provide that outline, about 60-70% better than what we had before its advent. So I, for one, think this in the medium term news will be good news for Indian IT. for now, there's a little bit more pain. I would assume pain for 18 to 24 months at least.
One of the concerns said here is that Indian IT has been, irrespective of our clients, been a cost arbitrage play also, though of course now we have built on that. Because of generative AI, do you see that? Because if they can do some of the basic stuff so well that you don't need the kind of mass of hirings which these companies did in the past, do you therefore see Indian IT being disproportionately being impacted compared to, say, their international competitors? What do I mean by this? Say somebody like a TCS or a Infosys or a Wipro getting more affected than, say, what an Accenture or a Capgemini would be. Is that a correct assumption, or do you think that because they also have large bases here, they would also be
the latter? The latter, because now, I mean, certainly this was a discussion that was valid and germane to this industry versus I mean, the Indians in this industry versus the non-Indians. I think that differentiation is now more or less gone. I think it's blurred to a point. They certainly, to my knowledge, I think Accenture has more people in, and IBM both have, and some of the other ones as well, have more people in India than they have in the US. So I think these are all global firms today. So whatever is true of, an Indian IT major is also true to a very large extent to an Accenture or an IBM. There is, however, one small piece that the Indians have not been able to do yet with any real capability. One slight exception may be Cognizant, and that is the higher value consulting, the strategy consulting, which is very industry driven and is very specific to certain industries. I don't think that the Indians have been able to capture that niche just yet. So, when you look at, the best way to figure that out really is to try and figure out what revenue per employee is, right? So if you look, I'll give you again just two figures. If you go back, say to about, let's go to around the GFC, right? Which is 2008. At that point, the average revenue per employee at Accenture was about $160,000 compared to about $69,000 for Infosys. This was because both Infosys are a lot of people, more people in India than Accenture, and Accenture had less people here. But Infosys also, what's happened is, as work has been pushed more offshore, what they were doing is 70-30 splits, 30% of the people on site and 70% of the people offshore, has now become more like a 90-10 for these sorts of projects. And if you look at the figures today, Accenture has come down. So if you look at revenue per employee on an Infosys, for example, it is still now 12, 14, 15 years later, it is still at about $60,000-$65,000. Whereas for Accenture, from 160, it has come down to 93,000. So that will give you some idea of what differentiation there is from a blend perspective. Accenture has a lot more people now to generate a similar amount of revenue than it had before. So they will be affected just as much, if you ask me. One exception being the strategy work, which will continue to be in their corner. I don't think our Indian majors can easily get it.
If I were to ask you to peep into a crystal ball and tell me this pain is left for what, 4 quarters, 6 quarters, what are we looking at before things correct itself? Or is it also dependent on how the global economy plays out, and specifically the US market, because we still continue to get about some 65% plus of our revenues from there?
Yes. So I think there's it depends on whether you believe whether a recession is coming or not. People have been talking about it for a year and a half, but there are some other factors that are out there that seem as if there may be a soft landing. But let's just assume that there is not one. If there is not a soft landing, I think that the pain will continue for a good 24 months before the rebuilding starts again. If there is a soft landing, there is still some internally caused pain. So I would expect at least 4 quarters of continued pain before anything goes away. So my best guess as an answer is, if there is a soft landing of mainly the US economy and it does not go into a huge recession, then Indian majors will still suffer for the next 4 quarters because of how much they bloated themselves in 21 and 22. But if there is not a soft landing, then I think the pain will continue for 24 months. This is my best assessment.
The good news is that you are saying that this is again another challenge which the IT industry as a whole, and specifically Indian IT players, have adapted to in the past, and you are saying that this is no different. This will play out and they will adapt to the changing market circumstances. That's the good news. But the bad news is you are saying that the pain is likely to sustain at least for the next 4 quarters before things start getting better.
I think so. And I also think that there is a fundamental change that is going to be difficult for them to do. The respect that they had as employers, I think, has gone down. Because there was some kind of a, they've been shown as being opportunistic. If you, on the one hand, are complaining about your employees moonlighting, but on the other hand, you're willing to hire your competitors' employees for doing exactly the same work at 2x the salary, then you cannot speak out of both sides of your mouth. And then if you go back and say, listen, I'm going to reduce the salary that I was giving you because you see, or that I was offering you, because the job is still on offer, but the salary is now about half, because I am facing pain in the marketplace. I mean, these are not things that are good news, and these are not good signals. So this business of being an employer of choice, I think that some of that sheen will go away. Some of the sheen that the Indian industry, IT industry used to have, is already lost. I think people don't necessarily think that IT is the smartest first job anymore. The good news is the rest of our economy has also done very, very well. So there are a lot of white collar jobs that are available out there that are non-IT. And I think that we will see some of our youngsters moving towards those.
Do you see consolidation in the sector happening, Sid, especially the smaller and mid-sized guys getting gobbled up?
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely there are mid-sized players in outside of India that would like to team up with mid-sized players or acquire mid-sized players here. Among the larger ones, I would be very, very surprised to see if there's anything that happens. But among the mid-sized players, I think definitely. I mean, there's the likes of EPAM from outside of India. There's the likes of Persistent here. We've also seen, by the way, the creation of essentially one of the top 6, I would say, Indian IT majors simply through acquisition. If you look at what L&T did with the acquisition of Mindtree, and after a little while, it was only a matter of time before they merged L&T Infotech with Mindtree, as they have done. And they now they've just through acquisition created a very, very large player. I think we will see some of that repeat.
This is a bit of an unfair question, but nonetheless, I have to ask you, do you see any player's strategy better than their competitors? Now, as an external observer, is somebody executing better, strategizing better than their competitors?
For me, I've always had I can answer that question. I mean, both as an insider, but now a little bit easier as an outsider, actually. So it's not so unfair. I will tell you the couple of players that I've always had a lot of respect for. One is TCS. It amazes me how they are able to execute quarter on quarter, year on year, and they've become a machine. And they really have the ability to execute extraordinarily well. I don't know whether it's a specific culture that they have, or I must say, I guess the only answer I have is it probably is the culture. Because people don't only work for money, as you know, Venkatesha. We have a lot of other things that we think are important. If I feel valued in an organization, if I feel that I'm working with people with similar interests as me, I will tend not to leave it for even if somebody is willing to give me a few thousand rupees more, I will tend not to go. I think TCS has managed that mantra really, really well. So I have a lot of respect for them from the outside. The other company that I have significant respect for is not Indian, actually, it's Accenture. And Accenture is, in the last 20 years, the way that it has morphed itself, no other company has been able to be as quick off the feet.
And especially at the scale at which they operate.
At the scale that they operate. So they're these two. I mean, Accenture always had offshoring, outsourcing is the new thing. We are outsourcers. Oh, offshoring is the new thing. We have a huge offshore presence. Oh, generative AI is the new thing. Just watch what's going to come out from them. Cloud is the new thing. Oh, we've got this. I mean, they are very, very nimble at that scale. Hundreds of thousands of people, and they just turn on a dime. TCS just executes, and like they say, that experience certainty, which is their tagline. I think the mischievous thing to say is they are boring, but they're boring because you know what you're going to get.
Boring is good as far as the
Clients
market
like
is
that.
concerned.
Yeah,
They
clients
love
like
boring predictability.
Yes.
On that note, thank you so much for your time, Sid.
Thank you
As
for having me.
always, a pleasure talking to you. The good news for the IT sector, and especially the Indian players, is that irrespective of whatever new technologies coming in, the sector will continue to survive, not only survive, but thrive. But the bad news is that the challenges will remain at least for the next 4 odd quarters, if not more. On that
Yes.
note, thank you for your insights and thanks for your comments, Sid.
Thank you for having me, Venkatesha.